Okay, we're trying this again. I don't know what the problem was with the last stream, but YouTube was giving me a message that it wasn't receiving enough data to support a live stream or whatever. I don't know. I had to just end it and start over again. But here we are. So, this is Lord of the Flies introduction. We are going to be taking an overview of this great book, and you're going to read it on your own as the last exercise of our class of this year. You're going to read it over the next 2 weeks, and you're going to write a short response to it, your reflections, your reaction, your response to the book. And many of the things that we talk about in class today will help you to understand and how to respond intelligently. Okay, so it'll be an opportunity for you to think through what the issues are. And basically, I want your assessment of whether you think the book is accurate, insightful, helpful, good, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it. It really is up to you to write your response. It really is truly is your response to this book. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that we have together. We thank you for this opportunity we have to think about Lord of the Flies. We do pray that you would give us wisdom and insight into this book as we read it together over the next couple of weeks, that you would help us to enjoy it and to benefit from it and to grow by it. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I've got a couple of short excerpts to share with you in class today that are from William Golding. So William Golding died in 1993, and back in the 50s and 60s, I have an interview from the 50s, and then I have his recording of the introduction to the audiobook of Lord of the Flies from the 60s. And I'm going to play those for you later in class, so you get to hear Golding's voice. William Golding was thus a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, in that they both were educated, highly educated writers writing in England in the 50s after World War II. Now, Golding is younger than Lewis and Tolkien. He did not fight in World War I, but he sort of has early childhood memories of the men coming back from World War I. So, he was a British novelist. He was born on September 19th, 1911, and he died in 1993, so not that long ago. He studied science and English at Oxford, so he was Oxford educated, and so part of the educated class of England. He fought in the Royal Navy in World War II, so whereas Lewis and Tolkien fought in World War I, Golding fought in World War II. He was a participant in the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. So again, that's something that he has in common with Lewis and Tolkien. They both fought for Great Britain in France against Germany, but in two different wars. At the war's end, he returned to teaching and writing, so he was a teacher as well as a writer, so he also has that in common with Lewis and Tolkien. And his first greatest literary success came with Lord of the Flies in 1954, which earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature. He is more highly regarded by literary scholars as being a writer of literary merit. Okay, so neither C.S. Lewis nor J.R.R. Tolkien ever won the Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature for Lord of the Flies. As a child, Golding had witnessed World War I. And when the men came back from World War I, scarred by the war, World War I was sold to the British public and to the American public as the war to end all wars. But just 21 years later, Britain was involved in another war to end all wars, which caused even more devastation. 25 million people approximately were killed by World War I. 50 million people approximately were killed by World War II. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki shocked the world, although it brought a quicker end to the war and probably saved lives in the end. It was something that which shocked a whole lot of people, ushered in the atomic age. And so Golding is writing in the 1950s in a time when it's the Cold War now. It's the U.S. and Great Britain against the Soviet Union and China. There's a great divide in the world. The Korean War had just been fought. And so we've gone from World War I to World War II to the Cold War, the atomic age. The atomic bomb had already been used in war. It existed and was being threatened to be used by the Soviet Union. And people lived in great fear of the possibility of an atomic bomb being dropped on London. People who remembered the London Blitz bombings of World War II were very fearful of the possibility of the Soviet Union launching a nuclear weapon atomic bomb at London and what devastation that would cause. So it was really a tough time. We think of the 1950s and we think of this sort of ideal age in American history when the suburban America was being born and the interstate highways were first being put in, and it was a prosperous economy. And it was, for America, many of those things. For Britain, it was a great time of rebuilding. It was also a great time of humbling because the British Empire was not what it once was. But it was also a time of fear because of the rising power of the Soviet Union in the world. So Golding had lived through World War II. He had seen the fall of France to Nazi Germany in 1940. Britain feared an invasion during World War II, and they tried to evacuate children to other countries. But in 1940, a German U-boat torpedoed a British ship carrying children, killing all the boys, and that meant that they would no longer send children overseas. Instead, they evacuated children to the English countryside, which became the setup for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? But here we have a story in Lord of the Flies where a plane full of boys during World War II are basically being evacuated from England, and their plane gets shot down, and they end up on a Pacific island, basically, is the storyline. And so after the war, this is what Golding said about writing Lord of the Flies. It was simply what seemed sensible for me to write after the war. When everyone was thanking God they weren't Nazis, I'd seen enough to realize that every single one of us could be Nazis. So everyone was saying, oh, I'm so thankful the Nazis didn't take over. We'd all be Nazis. And William Golding is saying, wait a minute, don't think too highly of yourselves. There might be more evil in your heart than you think. Golding once, as a teacher, allowed his class of boys. Now, he taught school-age boys. Tolkien and Lewis taught at the universities at Oxford and Cambridge, but Golding taught school-age boys. And once he allowed his class of boys total freedom in a debate, but he had to intervene as mayhem soon broke out, and he had his own experiences from war. Also, there was a very, very famous novel written in 1857 by a Scottish novelist, R.M. Ballantyne, called Coral Island. And this was a story, a Robinson Crusoe type story of a group of boys who ended up on a coral island in the Pacific, and what wonderful adventures they had and what fun times they had together. And Golding thought, that doesn't strike me as being super realistic. And so he wanted to give a more realistic exploration of human nature. Well, let's hear from Golding himself. What did he say? This is the introduction to the audiobook version that he recorded in the 1960s.
My name's William Golding, and I wrote this book, Lord of the Flies, in, I think it was either 1953 or 1954. There have been a great many things said about how it came to be written, and I don't know whether any of them are true or not. As far as I'm concerned, it happened because one day I was sitting one side of the fireplace and my wife was sitting the other, and I suddenly said to her, wouldn't it be a good idea to write a story about some boys on an island showing how they would really behave, being boys and not little saints as they usually are in children's books? And she said, that's a first-class idea, you write it. So I went ahead and wrote it. When girls say to me, and very reasonably, why isn't it a bunch of girls, and why did you write this about a bunch of boys? Well, my reply is, I was once a little boy, I have been a brother, I have been a father, I am going to be a grandfather, I have never been a sister, or a mother, or a grandmother. So this is why I wrote it really about little boys. That's one answer. Another answer is, of course, to say that if you, as it were, scale down human beings, scale down society, if you land with a group of little boys, they are more like scaled-down society than a group of little girls will be. Don't ask me why, and this is a terrible thing to say because I'm going to be chased from hell to breakfast by all the women who talk about equality. This is nothing to do with equality at all. I mean, I think women are foolish to pretend they're equal to men. They're far superior and always have been. But one thing you cannot do with them is take a bunch of them and boil them down, so to speak, into a set of little girls who would then become a kind of image of civilization, of society. That's another reason why they were little boys. The other thing is, why aren't they little boys and little girls? Well, if they'd been little boys and little girls, we being who we are, sex would have raised its lovely head. And I didn't want this book to be about sex. I mean, sex is too trivial a thing to get in with a story like this, which was about the problem of evil and the problem of how people are to live together in society, not just as lovers or man and wife.
All right, so that was William Golding's own introduction to his novel, explaining why he wrote this. Began with a conversation between him and his wife, and wanted to show what would really happen if boys were marooned on an island. Among his philosophical influences is said to be Thomas Hobbes, who was an English philosopher of the 17th century, 1600s, who believed that man is by nature selfishly individualistic and that man is constantly at war with other men. So in the state of nature, there was this philosophical debate going on in the 17th century, in the 1600s and then into the 1700s, about what was the state of nature like. And Thomas Hobbes was on the side that believed in total depravity. He believed that human beings were brutish, selfish, and he said that the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short. Life in the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short. So in many ways, Lord of the Flies is kind of an exploration of this philosophy, which is also, I would say, a biblical understanding of human nature, that we are sinful by nature and selfish, and we need structure and authority and the rule of law and governments to keep in check our natural tendency toward selfishness. So, some points to consider as you read this novel is that the people of Britain had just been through the Second World War. Even in the 1950s, food was still being rationed in Britain. Britain was much, much harder hit by World War II than the United States was. There was fear of a nuclear war between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. And also that in Nazi Germany, there had been a system of rewarding the strong and attacking the weak. The novel itself, by the way, was rejected 21 times before it was published. Many great novels were rejected many times before they were finally published. And that's because when things come along that are different than what's out there already, people often reject it, right? So anyway, there's 21 times it was rejected. This was his first novel, published in 1954. It wasn't successful, though, until the early 1960s. And by the way, it is on the American Library Association's list of the 100 most frequently challenged books of 1990 to 2000. I began my teaching career in the 1990s at a Christian school in Harford County, and I wanted to teach Lord of the Flies. And my administrator, the principal of the school, looked at me like I was crazy that I wanted to teach Lord of the Flies. And I said, I think it's a wonderful Christian exploration of human nature. He said, really? It's kind of dark and twisted? And I said, well, human nature is kind of dark and twisted, isn't it? And I eventually prevailed and was able to teach this book in the 98-99 school year, I think. So, whoa. So, through Lord of the Flies, Golding is making the statement that we cannot escape our own savage, violent tendencies. That even though we are civilized, we are still savages at heart and cannot escape those things. Without social order, we would devolve into a state of chaos. One of his famous quotes says, "If you don't have laws, then you are lost. If you don't have laws, then you are lost." It is set in the mid-1940s when Europe was engulfed in war. It's set during World War II. A plane carrying British schoolboys is mistaken for a military craft and shot down. It's shot down. Only the boys survive the crash. The pilot and crew are killed. There's a scar left on the island. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is the island they crash on. So you have Castle Rock at one end of the island, barren and rocky, and then you have the mountain, right? They crash and they get to the mountain and light a signal fire. There's a bathing pool and a beach. There are huts that they try to build along the beach. Simon explores a nature area. There's a scar left in the island by the plane crashing. It's heavily, heavily symbolic, this novel. It deals with the themes of civilization versus savagery, the loss of innocence, original sin, the fear that separates one from God, the nature of good and evil, the idea that goodness, when it is seen in people, is seen rarely and it is fleeting. It's often met with opposition. Simon is a character who shows us what goodness looks like when it shows up in human beings, and it is rare and fleeting and opposed with violence by those who have power. It is about absolute power, survival, human nature, lots of things. There are many allusions within the novel to classical literature, to mythology, and to Christian symbolism. It's very much a novel written in the tradition of Western literature, of the Christian world. Here are some of the most important symbols from the novel. The conch. They discover a conch shell, which you can blow into and makes a trumpet sound that could be heard basically all over the island. And so the conch becomes that which summons everyone to order out of disorder. And they come up with a rule that whoever is holding the conch has the right to speak. So it's a kind of symbol of democracy. It's a symbol of civilization, order, and democracy. There is a beast on the island, or is there a beast on the island? It is symbolic of fear, the fear that separates man from God, the fear that turns people on each other. Piggy's glasses, there's a character who's known simply as Piggy. That's not his real name. He wears glasses. He can't see well without them. His glasses are used to start a fire. So there's science and technology there. His glasses are what's used to start the fire. His glasses represent symbolically science, reason, insight. They are the last surviving evidence of a lawful, structured world. Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub, which is the title of the novel, is a representation of evil. There's a pig head on a stick. The fire signal represents hope and salvation. Snake represents evil. It's a reference to the serpent in the garden. So you should look for and be aware of religious symbols throughout. That this is an island, that there's a snake like the Garden of Eden. Man, this thing keeps jumping around on me. Sorry. I should not use that. There's a parachutist and Piggy. There's Jack and Ralph as leaders. There's Simon as a saint figure. So you definitely want to sort of be paying attention to these beast, Lord of the Flies, fear. There's an imaginary evil, the beast, right? And then there's a physical symbol of the acceptance of evil. That's the Lord of the Flies, the severed pig head on a stick. It's gruesome. It's bloody. It's a sign that the boys have at one level accepted evil, embraced evil and violence, and they do so in part out of fear. Fear of the beast, which is imaginary, leads them to embrace evil. This is a microcosm. The world on the island is a microcosm. It's a small world that is intended to represent the world at large. In that way, it is very symbolic. It's very archetypal. It's allegorical. It's mythical. Okay, it's Edenic. It's an Eden-like paradise setting. There is clean water for drinking. There is food for gathering. It is a place where all of their immediate needs have been provided for. There's a place where they can build a signal fire. They have the ability to build a signal fire. So it's not that they are totally without, they're not starving to death. They're not completely deprived, right? This is an Eden-like paradise setting, and yet they still turn to evil. An allegory is a work of fiction that carries two levels of meaning. We talked about this when we did Pilgrim's Progress earlier this year. This is similar to that, although it's not as explicitly and exclusively allegorical. But there's the surface plot, and then there's the symbolic representation of it. Golding himself, like Tolkien, preferred to think of his work as mythical in nature rather than allegorical. There are aspects of social influence, compliance. The person at whom the influence is directed is a target, and they are pressured to publicly conform to the wishes of the influencing source, but it does not change their private beliefs or attitudes. There's internalization, and that's where there is a change of beliefs or attitudes, right? And then there's identification of wanting to be part of a group. And then there's de-individuation. You'll see this a lot with the little ones, especially, but there's a mob mentality. That is when you're part of a group and the group is all doing something together, you just sort of join in the group and do it. You're not even thinking about yourself as an individual. All of these social influences can be seen in this novel. There's outward compliance without a change of inner belief. There is a change of inner belief. There is identification and a desire to belong. Kind of like we saw in That Hideous Strength, Mark's desire to belong to the inner circle. We see that dynamic at work here as well. And then de-individuation, you see the mob mentality at times. So the title is taken from the Hebrew Beelzebub. You've heard of Beelzebub, right, from the Bible? That's what Lord of the Flies is. So the god of the fly, Baal-Zeuv. Baal-Zeuv is the Lord of the Fly, the god of the fly, or Lord of the Flies. In the Bible, from Jesus, it's used as a synonym for Satan. And that's kind of how it's intended here. By the way, the very popular TV show Survivor was inspired by Lord of the Flies. There's also an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants called Club SpongeBob that was impacted by Lord of the Flies. But Lord of the Flies really deals with some essential questions about the nature of humanity. And I'm going to show you a second interview now. This is an interview with William Golding, where he's being asked by a literary scholar about his book and the symbolism of it and the representation of it. And so that's where this is important to see. Let me see if I can get this. Hold on a second. I want to do something.
Perhaps we might begin, Golding, by talking for a minute or two, at any rate, about an article on your work, which I know you liked, by John Peter, which appeared in the Kenyon Review about a year ago, in which he says many admiring things about all your books, but introduces a distinction between fable and fiction, and puts you very much on the fable side, arguing, for example, that in Lord of the Flies you incline occasionally not to give a sort of full-bodied presentation of people living and behaving, so much as an illustration of a particular theme. Would you accept this as a fair comment on your work?
Well, what I would regard as a tremendous compliment to myself would be if someone would substitute the word myth for fable, because I think a myth is a much profounder and more significant thing than a fable. I think, now perhaps this is merely, again, one of those semantic puzzles that we hear about, but I do feel fable as being an invented thing on the surface, whereas myth is something which comes out from the roots of things, possibly just in the Jungian sense, possibly in the ancient sense of being the key to existence. The whole meaning of life and experience as a whole.
Or indeed a total explanation of a certain human situation.
Total explanation of a certain human situation, yes. But if we can grant for the moment some kind of nexus between fable and myth, yes, I think I do tend to think in terms of the fabulous in that sense rather than in the immediate human situation.
Yes, you're not primarily interested in giving the sort of body and pressure of lived life in a wide society. Obviously not, because all your books, the three novels that you've published so far, have all been concerned with either persons or societies unnaturally isolated in some sense. Or perhaps unnaturally is not the right word here. But in Lord of the Flies, your boys are dropped onto a desert island. So is it legitimate to assume from that you are concerned with people in this kind of extremity of solitariness?
Well, no, I don't think it is legitimate. My own feeling about it is that their isolation is a convenient one rather than an unnatural one. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do see, but I'm not sure about the word convenient here. Convenient to you because you want to treat boys in the absence of grown-ups. Is this what you mean?
Yes, I suppose so, but you see, it depends how far you regard intentions as being readable. Now, you know about teaching people, and I know about teaching people. We both do it as our daily bread. Well, you see perhaps people who are not quite as immature as those I see. But my own immature boys that I see, I've watched them carefully, and there does come a point which is very legible in their society, at which you can see all these things are within a second of being carried out. It's the master who gets the right boy by the scruff of the neck and hauls him back.
Yes.
See? He is God who stops a murder being committed.
Yes, and this is why one of your boys, Piggy, often refers to the absence of grown-ups as the most important conditioning factor in the situation.
Yes.
The argument is then that out of a human group of this kind, the human invention, I hope this is not loading you too heavily, the human invention of evil will proceed provided that certain quite arbitrary checks are not present.
Yes, I think so. I think that the arbitrary checks that you talk about are nothing but the fruit of bitter experience of people who are adult enough to realize, well, I myself am vicious and would like to kill that man, and he is vicious and would like to kill me, and therefore it is sensible that we should both have an arbitrary scheme of things in which three other people will come in and separate us.
And this makes it interesting, I think, to consider the place among your boys of the boy Simon in Lord of the Flies, who is different from the others, and who understands something like the situation that you're describing. He understands, for example, that the evil that the boys fear, the beast they fear, is substantially of their own invention. But when in fact he announces this, he himself is regarded as the evil and killed accordingly. Are we allowed to infer from your myth that there will always be a person of that order in a group? Or is this too much?
It's, I think, a bit unfair, not so much because it isn't germane, but simply because it brings up too much. You see, I think, on the one hand, that it is true there will always be people who will see something particularly clearly and will not be listened to, and if they are particularly outstanding examples of their sort, will probably be killed for it.
Yes.
But on the other hand, that in itself brings up such a vast kind of panorama of existence. So you see, I mean, are we bringing God in now?
We'll see, can
Well,
we bring him into the third program or not?
Well, we'd have to eventually, I think.
Well, he jumps in at this point, doesn't he, you see, because what Simon is and what so many people, and now this is interesting, what so many intelligent people, and particularly, if I may say so many literary people find, is that Simon is incomprehensible. But he is comprehensible to the illiterate person. The illiterate person knows about saints and sanctity, and Simon is a saint.
Yes, well, he's a kind of scapegoat, I suppose.
No, I won't agree. I won't agree in the least. You are really flapping a kind of golden bow over me, aren't you, or waving it over my head, and I don't agree. You see, a saint isn't just a scapegoat. A saint is somebody who, in the last analysis, voluntarily embraces his fate, which is a pretty sticky one. And he is, for the illiterate, a proof of the existence of God, because the illiterate person who is not brought up on logic and not brought up always to hope for the worst, and says, well, a person like this cannot exist without a good God, do you see? And therefore the illiterate person finds Simon extremely easy to understand, someone who voluntarily embraces this beast, goes and tries to get rid of him, and goes to give the good news to the ordinary bestial man on the beach, and gets killed for it.
Yes, but now may I introduce the famous Lawrence caveat here: never trust the teller, trust the tale. What in fact?
That's absolute nonsense.
It's nonsense.
Absolute nonsense. I've never heard anything. Well, yes, I've heard even sillier remarks, but of course, the man who tells the tale, if he has a tale worth telling, will know exactly what he is about. And this business of the artist as a sort of starry-eyed, inspired creature dancing along with his feet 2 or 3 feet above the surface of the earth, not really knowing what sort of prince he's leaving behind him, is just, well, it's nothing like the truth.
It's nothing like the truth. So what I appreciate about William Golding is that he was just very much willing to tell this interviewer when he was really off base, and to tell him, look, no, that's exactly wrong what you're saying. And he won't let the interviewer get away with trying to neatly categorize. So Simon's just a scapegoat. No, Simon is a saint. And a saint is not just a scapegoat. Well, this is where we have to bring God into things. This is where educated literary people don't understand a character like Simon because he doesn't fit their model, and they say, oh, he's just a convenient scapegoat. But uneducated people, ordinary people, understand that he is a saint, and that he is actually existence he's proof of the existence of God, because such a person could not exist if there was no God. So what that interview leads us to see is that William Golding is really writing a very intentionally Christian-shaped myth, and so he is very much a literary contemporary with C.S. Lewis, who is writing the Chronicles of Narnia right at this time, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who is working on Lord of the Rings right at this time. So in Great Britain in the 1950s, you have William Golding writing Lord of the Flies, you have C.S. Lewis writing the Chronicles of Narnia, and you have J.R.R. Tolkien working on Lord of the Rings, and they're all working on these as myths, which are from a Christian worldview perspective, although of course they're 3 very different works of literature, but they have that in common. And so as myths, Golding is exploring some essential questions. What is the nature of man? Are people basically good or basically evil? What are the qualities of effective leadership? So think about, if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings or Narnia, think about the leadership qualities that come out there from Denethor, from Aragorn, from Peter, right? From Eustace Scrubb, even after he becomes a better boy, right? So how does leadership And so you're going to see leadership in this novel as well. How do you effectively govern a group of people? Upon what does survival depend? How are human flaws revealed? What do our flaws reveal about us? How does Golding use settings and characters in Lord of the Flies to express his ideas about people? So these are the kinds of questions that I would like you to respond to in the book when you write your short response to the book. By the end of reading this book, you should come to understand that people's basic instincts are often stronger than their nobler ones. And so their basic instincts, which is their fear, their thirst for survival, their thirst for violence, are often stronger than their nobler instincts of law and order and justice. The defects that we see in society are in fact coming from defects in human nature. This is the insight of Golding and others who I think see things truly. The reason why we have flawed human societies is because we are flawed human beings. Novelists often use fiction to make their statements about personal or political beliefs. Okay, let's get a look at some of the characters. Ralph. Ralph is the protagonist. He is 12 years old, but he's built like a boxer. He has blonde hair, he's tall, he's charismatic, he's a leader, he has logical thought, sense, and order. Jack is the antagonist. He is 12 years old, he has red hair, he is tall and thin, but he is very persuasive and he represents anarchy and savagery as he develops a love for hunting. He is very persuasive. He is very much a leader. But he becomes a leader of a subset of boys who are the hunters. Piggy. Piggy is short, overweight, and wears glasses. Early on when he meets Ralph, he tells Ralph, you can call me whatever you want to call me, but just don't call me Piggy, because that's what everybody at school called me, and I don't want to be called that. Well, Ralph later, in an exercise of power and trying to get influence, tells everyone else that his name is Piggy, and so that's what he's called throughout the entire novel. He represents order and democracy, intellectual power and insight. He is the smartest boy. He is the most insightful boy, but he is often, of course, bullied. And his glasses are used to start the fire. Simon. Simon is thin and frail. He's younger than Ralph, Jack, and Piggy, but he's older than the Little Uns. The Little Uns is another group that sort of gets depersonalized in their collectivism. Golding saw him as a saint. He represents pure natural goodness, a positive outlook. He's a bit of a loner and an outsider. He peacefully travels to tranquil spots on the island. Roger is evil. Nice Darth Maul picture there, huh? Sam and Eric. Twins, identical twins. You often can't tell the difference between the two of them. They do everything together. They're very easily excitable. They're allies with Ralph. So they're allies with Ralph, the protagonist. Sam and Eric. And then, why an island? Well, because you can isolate the boys from adults and you can show their true nature as they are away from external confines on their desires. So that's important. It's important that they be away from adults and away from the external confines on their true desires. And so it becomes a microcosm. It becomes a portrayal of what human nature is really like. The scar is the place, place on the island where the plane crashed. It symbolizes destruction. Their time spent on the island also leaves a scar. They start a big fire that gets out of control and burns a lot of the island. And the boys themselves scar themselves and one another internally and externally. So the scar is an important symbol of human destruction, human nature and its destructive effects. Face paint. The hunting group paints their faces. It serves as a mask that allows them to have a fake courage by sort of becoming something that they are not. It's a good question to ask what masks we wear. That's Jim Carrey in a famous movie called The Mask. I don't know if you know that movie, but anyway, that's enough of an introduction to Lord of the Flies. You get the idea. It's not a hard book to read. It's not a hard book to understand either. It's a little bit challenging in places. It's dark. It's disturbing. It's challenging in terms of really confronting human nature in its darkness. But I think overall you should enjoy it, and it should be a pretty quick and easy read for you. So you have 2 weeks to read it. I'll post an assignment for you to submit your response papers. But basically, you're just going to write a couple paragraphs of response saying basically what you learned from the novel, what you appreciated in it, what you saw in it, and then any responses you have to the negative as well, you can put in there. So that's it. That's our introduction to Lord of the Flies. This is our final class of the year, and I hope that you've learned something, and I look forward to reading your last writing, and I look forward to seeing you again whenever we can get out of this COVID quarantine and interact. I look forward to seeing you all maybe in class again next year. So thank you for a good year and a good class, and for being a good class. I pray that you have a good summer and an enjoyable read. If you run into questions as you're reading Lord of the Flies, feel free to ask. You can send me an email or Schoology message or whatever with particular questions you have if you run into difficult spots in the book. All right. See ya.